Sarah Williams pressed her face against the cold window of the bus as it wound through the hills of Virginia. The old vehicle groaned and shuddered with each turn, carrying her toward a life she never expected. At 19, she was leaving everything she knew behind for a job as a housemaid at Blackwood Manor, one of the oldest estates in the county. The letter crinkled in her sweaty palm as she read it again. The pay was better than anything she could find in town, enough to help her sick mother and maybe save for nursing school. But the isolation worried her. Blackwood Manor sat 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense woods that locals whispered about in hushed tones. When the bus finally stopped at a rusted gate marked with a faded Blackwood sign, Sarah gathered her single suitcase and stepped onto the gravel road. The driver, an elderly man with kind eyes, looked at her with concern. "You sure about this, miss? That place has a reputation." Sarah forced a smile. "I need the work, sir. Thank you for the ride." The bus disappeared around a bend, leaving her alone with the sound of wind through ancient oak trees. The walking path stretched before her, covered in fallen leaves that crunched under her worn shoes. After 20 minutes of walking, the mansion finally came into view. Blackwood Manor rose from the landscape like something from a nightmare. 3 stories of dark stone and twisted iron, with windows that stared down like empty eyes. Ivy crawled up the walls and several shutters hung at odd angles. The front steps were cracked, and weeds pushed through gaps in the stone. Sarah knocked on the heavy wooden door, her heart pounding. After a long moment, it swung open to reveal a thin woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "You must be Sarah Williams," the woman said in a crisp voice. "I am Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper. You are exactly on time. Good." Sarah followed her through a grand entrance hall that might have been beautiful once. Now dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight, and cobwebs decorated the corners. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floor. "The master of the house is Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Henderson explained as they walked. "He is a private man who prefers not to be disturbed. You will clean his study and bedroom when he is away from the house. He travels frequently on business." They climbed a narrow servant's staircase to the 3rd floor where Sarah's room waited. It was small but clean, with a single bed, a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the back gardens. "Breakfast is at 6, work begins at 7, Mrs. Henderson continued. "You will be responsible for the east wing, including the library and guest rooms. Stay out of the west wing entirely. That is the master's private area." Sarah nodded, though something in the woman's tone made her stomach twist with unease. "One more thing," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "If you hear strange noises at night, ignore them. Old houses make all sorts of sounds. Do not investigate. Do not mention anything you might hear to the master. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Henderson left her alone to unpack. Sarah sat on the bed and looked around her new home. Through the window, she could see the sun setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the overgrown gardens. In the distance, she thought she saw movement among the hedges, but when she looked more carefully, nothing was there. That first night, Sarah lay in bed listening to the house settle around her. The wooden floors creaked, pipes gurgled in the walls, and wind rattled the windows. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard something that made her eyes snap open. A low, rhythmic thumping sound came from somewhere below. It lasted for several minutes, then stopped. Sarah pulled her blanket up to her chin and tried to convince herself it was just the old heating system. The next morning brought her first glimpse of Blackwood. She was dusting the main staircase when she heard the front door open. A tall man in an expensive dark suit entered, removing his hat to reveal thick black hair that seemed to have an unusual sheen in the morning light. Mr. Blackwood was perhaps 40 years old, with sharp features and pale skin. There was something odd about the way he moved, too smooth and controlled, like a cat stalking prey. When he looked up and saw her on the stairs, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You must be the new maid," he said in a voice like silk over steel. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." "Thank you, sir. I'm Sarah Williams." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze traveling from her face down to her hands and back up. "I trust Mrs. Henderson has explained the rules of the house." "Yes, sir." "Good. I value my privacy above all else. As long as you respect that, we will get along well." He climbed the stairs past her, and Sarah caught a strange scent as he went by. It was musky and animal-like, nothing like the cologne she expected a wealthy man to wear. She watched him disappear down the hall toward the west wing, her skin prickling with goosebumps. The work was hard but not impossible. Sarah cleaned rooms that looked like they had not been used in years, wiping dust from expensive furniture and sweeping mouse droppings from corners. The library was her favorite place, filled with thousands of books on subjects she had never heard of. Many were written in languages she could not identify. Mrs. Henderson barely spoke to her except to give instructions. The cook, an elderly woman named Mary, was friendlier but seemed nervous whenever Sarah asked about the history of the house. "Been working here 15 years, Mary said one afternoon as Sarah helped her prepare dinner. "Mr. Blackwood is a good employer, pays well and on time, but there are things about this place better left alone." "What kind of things?" Mary glanced around as if checking for listeners. "Strange happenings, noises in the night. Sometimes I see lights moving in the forest when there should not be anyone out there, and the master himself," she shook her head. "There is something different about him." "Different how?" Before Mary could answer, they heard footsteps in the hall. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her expression stern. "Sarah, there is work waiting for you upstairs. Stop wasting time with gossip." That evening, Sarah was cleaning the windows in the east wing when she heard voices coming from the floor below. She recognized Mr. Blackwood's smooth tones, but there were others with him. The words were unclear, but something about their rhythm sounded wrong, like people speaking a language she had never heard before. Curiosity getting the better of her, Sarah crept to the top of the stairs and peered down into the main hall. Mr. Blackwood stood with 3 other men, all dressed in dark clothing. In the dim light, their faces looked strange, almost distorted. One of them turned his head in her direction, and Sarah gasped. The man's eyes reflected the lamplight like an animal's. For a moment they seemed to glow with an inner fire. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart racing. When she looked again, the hall was empty. Sleep came hard that night. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. Around midnight, she heard the thumping again, louder this time and accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices. It was coming from directly below her room. Sarah pressed her ear to the floor. The voices were clearer now, speaking in that same strange language she had heard earlier. There was something urgent about their tone, almost frantic. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. A scream, high-pitched and filled with terror. It lasted only seconds before being cut off abruptly. Sarah sat up in bed, her whole body shaking. She wanted to run, to pack her things and leave immediately, but she had nowhere to go and no money for transportation. The next morning, she noticed that one of the guest rooms she had cleaned the day before was now locked. Mrs. Henderson said nothing about it, but Sarah saw her disposing of bloody rags in the kitchen trash when she thought no one was looking. Days passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Sarah did her work mechanically, always listening for strange sounds, always watching for signs of whatever was happening in the house. She began to notice patterns. Mr. Blackwood left every few days and returned with guests. These visitors never stayed long, and she never saw them leave. The worst part was the way Mr. Blackwood looked at her. His stare had grown more intense, more predatory. Sometimes she caught him watching her from doorways or windows, his pale eyes following her movements. When she worked in the library, she often felt like someone was standing behind her, but when she turned around, no one was there. 2 weeks into her employment, Sarah was cleaning the master bedroom while Mr. Blackwood was away. The room was larger than her entire family's apartment back home, with dark wood furniture and heavy curtains that blocked most of the sunlight. As she dusted the dresser, her cloth caught on one of the drawers and pulled it open slightly. Inside, she saw something that made her knees weak. Photographs, dozens of them all showing the same thing. Young women all about her age, all with dark hair like hers. Some were clearly old from decades past, but others looked recent. In several of the pictures, the women appeared to be unconscious or worse. Sarah slammed the drawer shut and backed away from the dresser. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the dust cloth. She had to get out of this house, but how? The nearest town was 15 miles away through dark woods, and she had seen strange lights moving between the trees at night. That evening, as she served dinner to Mr. Blackwood and 2 new guests, Sarah tried to act normal despite her terror. The men spoke in low voices, occasionally glancing in her direction. When she leaned over to refill Mr. Blackwood's wine glass, he grabbed her wrist. "Such lovely skin," he murmured, running his thumb over her pulse point. So young and vital. Sarah jerked her hand away and hurried back to the kitchen, her heart pounding. Through the serving window, she watched the three men continue their conversation. One of them gestured toward the kitchen, and Mr. Blackwood nodded slowly. She was running out of time. Whatever these men were planning, she was part of it. Sarah waited until the house was quiet, then crept down to the kitchen to use the telephone. Her plan was to call the sheriff, but when she picked up the receiver, the line was dead. As she turned to go back upstairs, she heard the thumping sound again, much clearer now that she was on the first floor. It was coming from below, from what must be a basement she had not known existed. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Sarah followed the sound. Behind the kitchen pantry, she found a narrow door that looked like it led to storage. When she opened it, stone steps descended into darkness. The smell that rose from below was terrible, a mixture of decay and something else she could not identify. Sarah grabbed a candle from the kitchen and started down the steps. The walls were old stone, wet with condensation, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, a long corridor stretched ahead of her, lined with heavy wooden doors. The thumping was louder now, accompanied by muffled voices that sounded desperate. Sarah approached the first door and pressed her ear against it. Someone was inside, moving around frantically. She tried the handle, but it was locked. "Hello," she whispered. "Is someone in there?" The movement stopped suddenly. Then a woman's voice, hoarse from screaming, responded. "Please, please help me. He's going to kill me tomorrow night, please." Sarah's blood turned to ice. "Who's going to kill you, Mr. Blackwood?" "Yes, and the others. They're not human. Please, you have to get me out of here." Sarah tried the other doors. Behind each one, she found another prisoner. Young women, all terrified, all begging for help. Some had been there for weeks, others for only days. They told her stories that seemed impossible but explained everything she had witnessed. Mr. Blackwood and his associates were not human. They were something ancient and predatory, creatures that fed on human life force. The mansion was their hunting ground, and Sarah was intended to be their next victim. As she stood in that horrible basement, surrounded by the pleas of trapped women, Sarah realized that no one was coming to save them. The local authorities either did not know what was happening or were too afraid to act. If anyone was going to survive, it would be because she found a way to fight back. But how could a 19-year-old housemaid fight creatures that were older than the mansion itself? Sarah clutched her candle and tried to think. There had to be something, some weakness she could exploit. The women in the cells might know more about their captors. "Listen," she whispered urgently. "I'm going to get you all out of here, but I need information. What do you know about them? How do they hunt? What are they afraid of?" The woman in the first cell pressed her face against the small barred window in the door. "They're strongest at night, but sunlight weakens them. And there's something about their hair. I've seen them grooming each other like animals. It seems important to them somehow." Sarah filed this information away. Hair. She had noticed how thick and lustrous Mr. Blackwood's hair was, how it seemed to move in ways that natural law. Could that be connected to their power somehow? A sound from upstairs made them all freeze, footsteps on the kitchen floor above. Someone was awake and moving around. Sarah blew out her candle and felt her way back toward the stairs in the darkness. She had to get back to her room before she was discovered. But as she climbed the stone steps, she knew her time was running out. Tomorrow night, according to the woman in the cell, would be too late for at least one of the prisoners. Sarah had less than 24 hours to find a way to save them all. And to do that, she would have to discover the truth about what was hiding in Blackwood's hair. Sarah barely slept that night, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. Every creak of the old house made her jump, expecting to find Mr. Blackwood standing over her bed with those predatory eyes. When dawn finally broke, she forced herself to act normally, knowing that any change in behavior might alert him to her discovery. During breakfast preparation, Sarah watched Mary carefully. The elderly cook had worked at the mansion for 15 years. She had to know something about what was really happening here. When Mrs. Henderson left to inventory the linens, Sarah saw her chance. "Mary," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something important. The women who worked here before me, what happened to them?" Mary's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading. Her face went pale, and she glanced toward the door. "Child, you should not ask such questions. Please, I found the basement last night. I know what's down there." Mary dropped the dough and gripped the edge of the counter. "You went down there? Oh, child, what have you done, if he knows you have seen?" "He doesn't know yet, but I need your help. Those women are going to die if we don't do something." Mary looked around frantically, then pulled Sarah into the pantry and closed the door behind them. "Listen to me very carefully," she whispered. "Mr. Blackwood is not what he appears to be, neither are his friends. They are old things, older than this country, older than the oldest trees in these woods. My grandmother worked in this house when she was young. She told me stories that I thought were just tales to frighten children." "What kind of stories?" "About creatures that look like men but are not men. They feed on life itself, draining it from their victims slowly to make the experience last longer. The Blackwood family has lived in this area for over 200 years, but it is always the same man, never aging, never changing." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How is that possible? "The feeding keeps him young, but there is more. My grandmother said they have a weakness, something that gives them their power but also makes them vulnerable. She called it the nest of serpents, but would never explain what she meant." Before Sarah could ask more questions, they heard Mrs. Henderson calling for Mary. The women quickly left the pantry, but Sarah's mind was spinning with this new information. Nest of serpents. Combined with what the prisoner had said about their hair, a terrible picture was beginning to form. That morning, while cleaning the library, Sarah searched through the old books for anything that might help her understand what she was facing. Most of the volumes were in languages she could not read, but finally she found something useful. A leather-bound journal written in English, dated 1847. The journal belonged to a previous resident of the manor, a woman named Elizabeth who had married into the Blackwood family. Her early entries spoke of happiness and love, but as the months passed, her tone grew increasingly desperate. "My husband changes at night," she wrote. "His hair moves as if alive, writhing and twisting in ways that make my stomach turn. When I asked him about it, he grew angry and locked me in my room for 3 days without food. I begin to suspect that what I married is not entirely human." Sarah read faster, her heart pounding. Elizabeth had discovered that her husband and his associates were creatures that sustained themselves by slowly draining the life force from human victims. They kept their prey alive for weeks or months, feeding gradually to avoid detection. But the most important revelation came in Elizabeth's final entry. "I have learned the source of their power. Within their hair nest creatures from another realm, parasitic beings that give them strength and longevity. The hair is not hair at all, but a mass of these alien parasites. Fire is the only thing they fear, for it can destroy both host and parasites completely. I plan to act tomorrow night when brings his next victim to the basement. If I succeed, I will free all the prisoners. If I fail, I pray someone else will find this journal and finish what I started. The oil lamps in the house burn bright and hot. That is all I need." The journal ended there. Sarah sat back in her chair, her hands shaking. Elizabeth had discovered the truth and tried to stop them over a century ago. But she had failed because the creatures were still here, still hunting. Fire, that was the key. But how could one person with a few oil lamps hope to defeat creatures that had survived for hundreds of years? As if summoned by her thoughts, Mr. Blackwood appeared in the library doorway. Sarah quickly closed the journal and picked up her dust cloth, but she could tell from his expression that he suspected something. "Find anything interesting in your reading, Miss Williams?" His voice was casual, but there was a dangerous edge to it. Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze. "Just trying to understand the history of the house, sir. It's very fascinating." Mr. Blackwood moved closer, and Sarah caught that strange, musky scent again. This close, she could see that his hair did indeed seem to move slightly, as if stirred by a breeze that touched nothing else in the room. "History can be dangerous, Miss Williams. Sometimes the past is better left buried." He reached out and touched a strand of her hair, twirling it around his finger. "Such beautiful hair you have, so full of life. I imagine it will be even more lovely when it is, properly tended." Sarah jerked her head away, fighting the urge to run. "I should get back to my work, sir." "Yes, you should, but first I have a special request. Tonight I will be entertaining guests in the main dining room. I would like you to serve dinner instead of Mary. She is feeling unwell." It was not a request, and they both knew it. Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Mr. Blackwood smiled, showing teeth that seemed slightly too sharp. "Excellent, wear your best dress. My guests appreciate beauty." After he left, Sarah sank into a chair, her whole body shaking. Tonight. Whatever they were planning would happen tonight. She had to act before then, but how could she fight creatures that were stronger and faster than any human? The answer came to her as she was helping Mary prepare lunch. The gas lines that fed the kitchen stoves ran throughout the house, including to the basement where the prisoners were kept. If she could find a way to rupture those lines and create a large enough fire. But the timing would have to be perfect. She needed to free the prisoners first, then create the fire when Mr. Blackwood and his guests were all in one place. And she would need help. "Mary," she said quietly, "how many people work in this house?" "Just us three, Mrs. Henderson, myself, and now you. Why do you ask?" "Where do Mrs. Henderson's loyalties lie? Is she human?" Mary's face went white. "Mrs. Henderson has worked here longer than I have. She came when I was still new, maybe 20 years ago. I always thought. But now that you mention it, she never seems to age. And sometimes I catch her looking at the new maids the same way Mr. Blackwood does." Sarah's heart sank. If Mrs. Henderson was one of them, then she was truly alone in this fight. But she could not give up, not with those women depending on her. That afternoon, while Mrs. Henderson was in town buying supplies and Mr. Blackwood was in his study, Sarah made her preparations. She found tools in the basement maintenance room and located the main gas line. With careful work, she managed to loosen several connections without causing an immediate leak. When the time came, a simple twist would rupture the lines completely. She also explored the basement more thoroughly, counting 8 cells with prisoners inside. The women were in various stages of despair and malnutrition, but they were alive. Sarah whispered her plan through the cell doors, telling them to be ready to run when she gave the signal. As evening approached, Sarah put on her best dress as instructed. It was a simple blue cotton dress her mother had made for church, nothing fancy but clean and modest. She looked at herself in the small mirror and wondered if this would be the last time she would see her reflection. In the kitchen, she helped Mary prepare an elaborate dinner for Mr. Blackwood's guests. 7 courses of rich food that made Sarah's stomach turn as she thought about what these creatures really fed on. "I won't be serving tonight," Mary said quietly as she handed Sarah a tray of appetizers. "Mrs. Henderson said I should retire early with my illness, but child," she gripped Sarah's arm. "Whatever you are planning, be careful. These things have survived for centuries. They are clever and ruthless." Sarah nodded and carried the tray to the dining room. Mr. Blackwood was there with 4 other men, all dressed in expensive suits and all sharing that same predatory aura. Their eyes followed her movements as she set out the food, and she could hear them speaking in that strange language when they thought she was out of earshot. As the evening progressed, Sarah served course after course, waiting for the right moment. The men drank heavily, some dark wine that stained their lips red and made their eyes glow brighter. Their conversation grew more animated, and she began to understand a few words. They were discussing the prisoners below, debating which one to take first. Finally, as Sarah was clearing the dessert plates, Mr. Blackwood stood up and addressed his guests. "Shall we adjourn to the basement? Our feast awaits." This was it. Sarah's hands trembled as she carried the dishes to the kitchen, but her mind was crystal clear. She had maybe 10 minutes while they went downstairs and selected their victim. It had to be enough. She ran to the basement access in the pantry and quickly descended the stone steps. The creatures were in the far corridor, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Sarah went to work on the gas connections, turning valves and loosening fittings until she could smell the gas beginning to leak. Then she began unlocking the cell doors. She had found Mrs. Henderson's key ring earlier and taken the basement keys. One by one, the prisoners stumbled out, weak but desperate to escape. "Follow me," Sarah whispered. "Stay quiet until we reach the kitchen, then run for the woods. Don't stop until you reach town." The first 3 women made it to the stairs without incident. But as the 4th prisoner was climbing up, one of Mr. Blackwood's guests appeared at the far end of the corridor. "What do we have here?" he said in accented English. His voice carried easily through the basement, and Sarah heard answering calls from the others. "Run," Sarah shouted to the remaining prisoners. "Get out now." She turned to face the creature approaching her. In the dim light, she could see his hair writhing like a nest of snakes, and his eyes glowed with an inner fire. He was fast, but Sarah was ready for him. She struck a match and threw it at the gas-soaked floor. Flames erupted instantly, racing along the lines she had ruptured. The creature shrieked and leaped backward as fire surrounded him. But there were still others in the basement, and Sarah could hear them moving toward her position. She ran for the stairs, striking matches and throwing them behind her as she went. The gas-fed flames spread quickly, but not quickly enough to cut off all pursuit. She reached the kitchen just as Mr. Blackwood appeared at the bottom of the basement stairs, his face twisted with rage. His hair was moving frantically now, writhing like a mass of angry serpents. "You stupid girl," he snarled. "You have no idea what you have done." Sarah backed toward the kitchen's gas stove, still holding a handful of matches. "I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped you from killing any more innocent people." Mr. Blackwood started up the stairs, moving with inhuman speed. But as the flames spread below, Sarah could see that he was weakening. The fire was destroying his source of power. She struck her last match and held it toward the kitchen gas line. "Stay back, or I'll burn this whole house down with all of us in it." For the first time since she had met him, Mr. Blackwood looked uncertain. Behind him, Sarah could hear the screams of his associates as the fire consumed them. The basement was becoming an inferno, and the flames were beginning to spread to the first floor. "You will die too," he said. "The fire will kill you as well." "Maybe," Sarah replied, "but at least I'll die free and those women will live. That's more than you can say for your victims." Mr. Blackwood hesitated for a crucial moment, and in that pause, Sarah heard the sound she had been hoping for. Sirens in the distance. The escaping prisoners had made it to town and brought help. The creature seemed to hear them too. His face contorted with fury, and he launched himself up the stairs toward her. Sarah dropped the match onto the gas line and dove toward the kitchen door. The explosion that followed shook the entire house. Windows shattered, walls cracked, and a pillar of flame shot up through the basement and first floor. Sarah was thrown against the kitchen wall, her ears ringing and her vision blurred. When she struggled to her feet, she saw Mr. Blackwood writhing on the floor near the basement entrance. His hair was on fire, and the parasitic creatures within it were visible now as they burned. They looked like tiny serpents made of shadow and malice, screaming as they died. The fire spread quickly through the old house, fed by gas lines and decades of dry wood. Sarah stumbled toward the front door, choking on smoke and barely able to see. Behind her, she could hear Mr. Blackwood's inhuman screams as the flames consumed him completely. She made it outside just as the first fire truck arrived, followed closely by police cars and an ambulance. The escaped prisoners were there too, wrapped in blankets and giving statements to officers who looked skeptical but concerned. Sarah collapsed on the front lawn and watched Blackwood Manor burn. The flames rose high into the night sky, visible for miles around. And as the fire reached its peak, she could swear she heard the screams of more than just the creatures who had died tonight. She heard the voices of all their victims over the centuries, finally free to rest in peace. The investigation that followed would raise more questions than it answered. Officials would find the remains of dozens of victims in the basement, some dating back over a century. But they would never find a satisfactory explanation for what had happened at Blackwood Manor. Sarah told them she had been held prisoner and escaped when a gas leak caused an explosion. The other survivors backed up her story, though their accounts of inhuman captors were dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations. The important thing was that it was over. The creatures were dead, their victims were free, and Blackwood Manor was nothing but ashes and memories. But as Sarah rode in the ambulance toward the hospital, she noticed something that chilled her blood. The paramedic treating her cuts had unusually thick hair that seemed to move slightly in the vehicle's dim light. She told herself it was just her imagination, a lingering effect of the trauma she had endured. But deep down, she wondered if the creatures that had haunted Blackwood Manor were truly unique, or if they were part of something much larger and more terrifying than she had imagined. 3 months after the fire at Blackwood Manor, Sarah Williams sat in the waiting room of Mary's Hospital in Richmond, Virginia. Her hands shook slightly as she read the newspaper article for the 10th time. The headline read, "Mysterious disappearances continue despite Blackwood Manor destruction." Since the manor burned down, 17 people had vanished from towns across 3 states. All were young women with dark hair, all disappeared without a trace. The police insisted there was no connection to the Blackwood case, but Sarah knew better. She had seen the paramedic's writhing hair that night, and the fear in his eyes when she stared at him too closely. Dr. Hayes entered the waiting room with a folder in her hands. Sarah had been meeting with the psychiatrist twice a week since the incident. officially to deal with trauma, but really to have someone who might believe her story. "How are you feeling today, Sarah?" Dr. Hayes asked as they settled into her office. "The same, worried that it's not over." Dr. Hayes opened Sarah's file. She was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and graying hair that hung in loose curls around her shoulders. Unlike the other doctors Sarah had seen, she listened without immediately reaching for prescription pads or dismissive explanations. "Tell me about these concerns again. What makes you think the creatures from the manor are still active?" Sarah pulled out a folder of newspaper clippings she had been collecting. "Look at the pattern. Young women disappearing from small towns. Always places with limited police resources, always victims who won't be missed immediately. It's exactly how Blackwood operated." Dr. Hayes examined the clippings carefully. "The police have investigated these disappearances. They found no evidence of supernatural involvement. Because they don't know what to look for. They're looking for human predators using human methods, but these things are different. They can blend in perfectly, and they have resources we can't imagine." "You mentioned the paramedic who treated you that night. Have you tried to locate him?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "He disappeared from the ambulance service records the day after the fire. No one remembers hearing him, and his identification was fake, just like I thought it would be." Dr. Hayes leaned forward in her chair. "Sarah, what if I told you that you're not the first person to come to me with this kind of story?" Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" "5 years ago, I treated a young man named David. He claimed to have escaped from a group of creatures that fed on human life force. They kept their victims in an abandoned warehouse in Baltimore. David managed to burn the place down, just like you did at the manor." "Where is he now?" "Dead, officially. It was a car accident 3 months after he destroyed the warehouse. But David was convinced they would find him eventually. He was terrified until the end." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Do you think he was right? Do you think they killed him?" "I think David believed they were real, just like you do. And whether they exist or not, the fear is destroying your life. You've dropped out of nursing school, you rarely leave your apartment, and you're obsessed with finding evidence of these creatures. That's not healthy." Sarah stood up and walked to the window. Outside, people went about their normal lives, unaware that predators might be walking among them wearing human faces. "Dr. Hayes, what would convince you that I'm telling the truth?" "Evidence, real evidence that could be by others." Sarah turned back to face her. "Then I'm going to get you that evidence, because I can't live like this, wondering when they're going to come for me or someone else I care about." That afternoon, Sarah drove to the ruins of Blackwood Manor. The foundation was still there, blackened stone and twisted metal marking where the house had stood. Local authorities had cordoned off the area, but Sarah found a gap in the fence where she could slip through. The basement was partially collapsed, but she could still make out the corridor where the cells had been. Using a flashlight, she searched through the debris for anything that might have survived the fire. Most of the organic material was completely destroyed, but metal objects might have endured. After an hour of careful searching, she found what she was looking for. A piece of jewelry, probably a necklace, that had belonged to one of the victims. But more importantly, she found something else embedded in the melted stone near where Mr. Blackwood had died. It looked like a small piece of bone, but it was unlike anything she had ever seen. The surface had a strange, iridescent quality, and when she held it up to the light, it seemed to shift and change color. This was not human bone. This was something else entirely. Sarah wrapped the bone fragment carefully and put it in her bag. Physical evidence of the creature's non-human nature was exactly what Dr. Hayes had asked for. But as she prepared to leave the ruins, she heard something that made her freeze. Footsteps. Someone else was walking through the debris, moving carefully but purposefully. Sarah turned off her flashlight and crouched behind a pile of rubble. Through a gap in the stones, she could see a figure moving through the ruins with a handheld metal detector. The person was wearing dark clothing and a wide-brimmed hat that hid their features. They seemed to know exactly what they were looking for, scanning specific areas where the basement cells had been located. As they moved closer to Sarah's hiding spot, she caught a glimpse of their face in the moonlight. It was Mrs. Henderson. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Henderson had supposedly died in the fire along with Mr. Blackwood and his guests. But here she was, very much alive and searching through the ruins. As Sarah watched, The former housekeeper's metal detector began beeping rapidly near the spot where Sarah had found the bone fragment. Mrs. Henderson knelt down and began digging through the debris with her hands. After a few minutes, she pulled out several more pieces of the strange bone. She examined them carefully, then spoke into a small radio. "I found fragments from at least 3 hosts," she said in a voice that carried clearly in the still air. "The nest keepers are destroyed, but we may be able to extract genetic material for reconstruction." A tinny voice responded from the radio, but Sarah could not make out the words. Mrs. Henderson listened, then replied, "Yes, the girl is still alive. We've been monitoring her activities. She knows too much, but she may be useful. The hosts are becoming harder to create, and her resistance to the feeding process suggests she might be compatible for conversion." Sarah felt sick. They were talking about her and about turning her into one of them. She had to get away from here and warn Dr. Hayes. But as she tried to move backward through the rubble, her foot slipped and sent a piece of concrete clattering down the pile. Mrs. Henderson's head snapped up immediately. In the moonlight, Sarah could see that her hair was moving, writhing like the parasitic creatures that had nested in Mr. Blackwood's scalp. "Come out, Sarah," Mrs. Henderson called in a voice that was no longer entirely human. "I know you're here. I can smell your fear." Sarah ran. She crashed through the debris, not caring about the noise she was making. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Henderson giving chase, moving with inhuman speed and agility. Sarah reached the fence and squeezed through the gap, her clothes tearing on the wire. Her car was parked 50 yards down the road. Sarah fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit them into the ignition. In her mirror, she saw Mrs. Henderson emerge from the ruins and sprint toward her with impossible speed. The engine finally started, and Sarah floored the accelerator. Her car shot forward just as Mrs. Henderson reached the road. In the mirror, Sarah saw the creature that had once been the housekeeper watching her escape, its hair writhing in fury around its head. Sarah drove straight to Dr. Hayes' emergency number, calling from the car phone as she sped through the Virginia countryside. "Dr. Hayes, it's Sarah. I have proof, but they're still alive and they're coming for me." "Sarah, calm down. Where are you?" "Driving back from the manor ruins. Mrs. Henderson is alive, and she's one of them. She was looking for remains, trying to rebuild or create new hosts, and they're planning to convert me into one of them." There was a long pause on the phone. "Sarah, Mrs. Henderson died in the fire. Her body was recovered and identified. Then they faked her death somehow, or the thing I saw tonight was never human to begin with. Dr. Hayes, I found physical evidence. Bone fragments that aren't human. Can you meet me at your office? I need someone to verify what I found." "It's midnight, Sarah. The building is locked." "Please, I can't go home. They know where I live and they're monitoring me. I need help." Dr. Hayes sighed. "All right, I'll meet you at the office in 30 minutes, but Sarah, if this turns out to be another false alarm." "It's not, I promise you it's not." Sarah drove to the medical building where Dr. Hayes had her office, checking her mirrors constantly for signs of pursuit. The parking lot was empty except for Dr. Hayes' car, and Sarah felt a moment of relief as she hurried toward the building entrance. Dr. Hayes was waiting in the lobby, looking tired but concerned. She let Sarah in and led her up to her office, turning on the lights and locking the door behind them. "All right," she said, "show me this evidence." Sarah carefully unwrapped the bone fragment and placed it on Dr. Hayes' desk. In the fluorescent light, its iridescent surface was even more obvious. The doctor picked it up and examined it closely, frowning. "This is unusual," she admitted. "The structure doesn't look human, and this coloration, I've never seen anything like it." "There's more. I saw Mrs. Henderson at the ruins tonight. She was collecting more fragments and talking about genetic reconstruction. She said they're planning to convert me into one of them." Dr. Hayes set the bone down and looked at Sarah with new seriousness. "If you really saw Mrs. Henderson alive, then we need to call the police immediately." "They won't believe us. They'll think I'm having some kind of breakdown." "Then what do you suggest?" Sarah had been thinking about this during the drive. "We need to find where they're operating now. Mrs. Henderson was taking orders from someone, which means there's a new base of operations. And if I'm right about the disappearances, they're still taking victims." "That's incredibly dangerous, Sarah. If these creatures are real, then investigating them could get you killed." "I'm already living on borrowed time. They know I survived Blackwood Manor, and they know I'm looking for them. The only way I'll ever be safe is if I expose them completely or destroy them like I did before. Dr. Hayes was quiet for several minutes, studying the bone fragment and Sarah's collected newspaper clippings. Finally, she spoke. I have a colleague at Johns who specializes in forensic anthropology. If anyone can identify what this bone fragment really is, it's Dr. Martinez. Would you be willing to take it to her? Yes, absolutely. And I think you're right about the police, but there might be other people who would take this seriously. Federal authorities who deal with unusual cases. Sarah felt a spark of hope. Do you know someone? Possibly. A former patient of mine works for the FBI in their Unusual Phenomena Division. She might be willing to listen if I vouch for you. What's her name? Agent Torres. She investigated a case in Nevada 5 years ago that sounds remarkably similar to what you've described. A group of predators that weren't entirely human, keeping victims in underground facilities. Sarah leaned forward eagerly. What happened to them? According to the official report, nothing. The case was closed due to lack of evidence, but always believed there was more to it. She might be our best chance of getting someone in authority to take this seriously. Dr. Hayes picked up her phone and dialed a number from memory. It rang several times before a sleepy voice answered. It's Hayes. I'm sorry to call so late, but I have a patient here who needs your help. Yes, it's about the Nevada case. I think you're going to want to hear this. As Dr. Hayes explained the situation to Agent Torres, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in months. Genuine hope. Maybe she was not alone in this fight after all. Maybe there were others who understood the threat these creatures posed. But even as she allowed herself to feel optimistic, Sarah could not shake the memory of Mrs. Henderson's writhing hair and inhuman speed. The creatures were adapting, evolving their methods, and they were not going to stop hunting until they had eliminated everyone who knew their secret. The war was far from over. In fact, Sarah was beginning to realize that the destruction of Blackwood Manor had been just the first battle in a much larger conflict. A conflict that would determine whether humanity remained the dominant species on Earth or became nothing more than livestock for creatures that had learned to hide in plain sight. Outside Dr. Hayes' office window, the first light of dawn was beginning to appear on the horizon. But Sarah knew that for people like her, the darkness was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in the sterile white laboratory of Dr. Martinez at Johns University in Baltimore. The forensic anthropologist was examining the bone fragment under a powerful microscope, her expression growing more puzzled by the minute. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Martinez murmured, adjusting the focus. "The cellular structure is unlike anything in the known fossil record. It appears to be organic, but the mineral composition suggests it's been altered by some kind of parasitic relationship." Sarah exchanged glances with Agent Torres, who had driven up from Washington that morning. The FBI agent was a small woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an air of barely contained energy. She had listened to Sarah's story without skepticism, which was more than most law enforcement officials had done. "Parasitic how?" Agent Torres asked. Dr. Martinez stepped back from the microscope. "Come look for yourselves. See these thread-like structures running through the bone matrix? They're not part of the original skeletal system. They appear to be some kind of invasive organism that has integrated with the host's bone tissue." Sarah peered through the microscope and gasped. The bone fragment was riddled with tiny, serpentine structures that pulsed with a faint inner light. Even in death, the parasites seemed to be alive somehow. "Is it possible that these organisms could control a host body?" Agent Torres asked. "In theory, yes. We know that certain parasites can influence host behavior in the animal kingdom. But this level of integration suggests something far more sophisticated. These organisms have essentially replaced the host's nervous system with their own." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. So the people at Blackwood Manor, they weren't just being fed on, they were being converted into something else entirely. "That's my assessment," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "This represents a form of biological parasitism that we've never documented in modern science. Where did you say you found this?" Before Sarah could answer, Agent Torres' phone rang. She stepped away to take the call, speaking in low, urgent tones. When she returned, her face was grim. "We need to leave, now." "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. "That was my supervisor. Someone's been asking questions about our investigation, and they have enough influence to make problems for all of us. We're being ordered to cease all activity related to this case." Dr. Martinez frowned. "Who has that kind of authority?" "People with connections in very high places. The kind of connections that suggest this conspiracy goes deeper than we thought." Sarah's heart sank. "So that's it, we just give up." Agent Torres smiled grimly. "I didn't say that. I said we're being ordered to cease official activity. What we do in our personal time is another matter entirely." They left the laboratory separately, with plans to meet later at a safe house Agent Torres maintained outside the city. But as Sarah walked to her car, she noticed a black sedan following her at a distance. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside, but she could feel eyes watching her every move. At the first red light, Sarah turned to get a better look at the sedan's driver. The man behind the wheel was wearing sunglasses despite the overcast day, and his hair seemed to have an unusual thickness and sheen. When he noticed her staring, he smiled, revealing teeth that looked slightly too sharp. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She fumbled for her phone and called Agent Torres. "They found me," she whispered when the agent answered. "There's one of them following me right now." "Stay calm, don't lead them to the safe house. Drive to the nearest police station and park in front. They won't try anything in a public place with witnesses." Sarah followed the instructions, but when she pulled into the police station parking lot, the black sedan continued down the street without stopping. Through her mirror, she watched it disappear around a corner. But she knew this was just a warning. They were letting her know that she was being watched. Agent Torres arrived 20 minutes later and escorted Sarah into the police station. They spoke to the desk sergeant about the surveillance, but without concrete evidence of a crime, there was little the local police could do. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Agent Torres said as they sat in her car outside the station. "If they're bold enough to follow you in broad daylight, it means they're planning to move soon." "Move how?" "Either to eliminate us or to relocate their operation. Based on what you've told me about these creatures, they're adaptable and patient, but they're also vulnerable when forced to act quickly." Sarah nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "I've been analyzing the disappearance patterns you documented. I think I know where they might be operating now. There's an abandoned industrial complex outside Winchester, Virginia. It was used for chemical manufacturing until the company went bankrupt 3 years ago." Agent Torres pulled out a map and pointed to a location about 90 miles southwest of their current position. 6 of the recent disappearances happened within a 50-mile radius of this facility, and public records show it was purchased 6 months ago by a shell corporation with ties to offshore accounts. "Sounds like our target. When do we go?" "Tonight, but Sarah, I need you to understand something. I'm asking you to help me investigate what could be an extremely dangerous situation. You've already done more than anyone should have to. If you want to back out now, I'll understand." Sarah thought about the women she had rescued from Blackwood Manor, about the victims whose disappearances were listed in her newspaper clippings, about the countless others who might be taken if these creatures were not stopped. "I'm in," she said, "but we're going to need help. How do we fight creatures that are stronger and faster than normal humans?" Agent Torres smiled and opened the glove compartment of her car. Inside was a compact flamethrower, not much larger than a spray bottle. "Fire, you were right about that being their weakness. After the Nevada case, I started researching ways to fight parasitic entities. High-temperature flames disrupt their nervous systems and destroy the host-parasite bond." "How many of those do you have?" 4, plus incendiary grenades and magnesium flares. If these things are as vulnerable to fire as you believe, we should have enough firepower to handle a small group of them." That evening, they drove to Winchester in Agent Torres' unmarked federal vehicle. The abandoned chemical plant sat on 200 acres of empty land, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Most of the windows were broken, and weeds grew through cracks in the parking lot. But there were signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, new padlocks on some of the gates, and light visible through boarded-up windows in one section of the complex. "Motion sensors on the fence," Agent Torres observed, studying the perimeter through binoculars. "And that's not security lighting. Someone's definitely using this place." They parked a mile away and approached on foot, using the cover of darkness to avoid the sensors. Sarah carried one of the compact flamethrowers, while Agent Torres had another plus a bag of incendiary devices. The building they targeted was a 3-story concrete structure that had once housed administrative offices. The lights Sarah had seen were coming from the basement level, visible through small windows that were partially below ground. "Same pattern as Blackwood Manor," Sarah whispered. "They like underground spaces." Agent Torres nodded and led the way to a loading dock on the building's north side. The metal door was secured with a new electronic lock, but the FBI agent produced a small device that bypassed it in seconds. Inside, the building smelled of dust and chemical residue from its industrial past. But underneath those odors was the same musky, animal scent Sarah remembered from the manor. The creatures were definitely here. They found the stairs to the basement level and descended carefully, using night vision goggles to navigate without turning on lights. The basement had been converted into something that made Sarah's stomach turn. Rows of holding cells, just like at Blackwood Manor but more sophisticated. Each cell had its own life support system, allowing the creatures to keep victims alive for extended periods. And the victims were there, dozens of them in various stages of the feeding process. But worse than the imprisoned humans was what Sarah saw in the center of the basement. A laboratory where the creatures were conducting experiments. Tables covered with biological samples, tanks filled with floating tissue cultures, and worst of all, a series of vats containing what looked like human bodies in various stages of parasitic infection. "They're not just feeding," Agent Torres whispered. "They're trying to create more of themselves." Sarah pointed to a corner of the lab where several figures in white coats were working under bright lights. From this distance, they looked human, but their hair moved with that telltale serpentine motion. "How many do you count?" Agent Torres asked. "At least 6 in the lab, plus whoever might be upstairs. We're outnumbered." "Not necessarily. Look at this." Agent Torres had found the building's old fire suppression system. The chemical plant had been equipped with a network of sprinkler heads designed to flood the facility with fire-retardant chemicals in case of emergency. But someone had modified the system, replacing the chemical tanks with containers of gasoline. They turned the safety system into a weapon, Sarah realized. If there's a fire, the sprinklers will spread accelerant instead of putting it out. Which means if we can trigger the system and then ignite it, this whole basement will become an inferno. That should be enough to destroy every parasite in the building. They spent 20 minutes preparing, using Agent Torres' equipment to set delayed ignition charges throughout the basement. The plan was simple: free as many prisoners as possible, retreat to a safe distance, and then trigger the fire suppression system remotely. But as they were working on the prison cells, one of the creatures in the laboratory looked up and saw them. It let out a shriek that was definitely not human, and suddenly the entire basement was in chaos. The other creatures moved with inhuman speed, abandoning their experiments and racing toward the intruders. Sarah managed to open 3 cells before the first attacker reached her, but then she was forced to defend herself with the flamethrower. The compact weapon worked exactly as advertised. A stream of high-temperature fire struck the creature's center mass, and it immediately began screaming and convulsing. Its hair writhed frantically as the parasites within it burned, and within seconds the thing that had once been human collapsed into a smoking pile of ash. Agent Torres was having similar success with her weapon, but there were too many creatures and not enough time to free all the prisoners. More were coming down from the upper floors, drawn by the commotion. "We have to trigger the system now," Agent Torres shouted over the inhuman screeching. "Get to the exit." They fought their way toward the stairs, using their flamethrowers to clear a path through the attacking creatures. Sarah's weapon was running low on fuel, and she could see that Agent Torres was in the same situation. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah turned back to see the prisoners still trapped in their cells. Many were conscious and reaching through the bars, begging for help. She could not just leave them to burn. "Go," she told Agent Torres. "Trigger the system in 60 seconds." Sarah ran back into the basement, using her remaining fuel to drive off the creatures that were trying to prevent her from reaching the cells. She managed to free 8 more prisoners before her flamethrower finally emptied. A creature that had once been a middle-aged woman lunged at her with claws extended. Sarah ducked and rolled, pulling out the magnesium flare Agent Torres had given her as backup. She struck the flare and thrust it at the creature's face. The magnesium burned at over 3,000 degrees, hot enough to melt steel. The creature's head simply disintegrated, taking the parasites within it to oblivion. Sarah herded the freed prisoners toward the stairs, but she could see more creatures pouring down from above. They were trapped between two groups of enemies with no weapons left. Then Agent Tor's voice crackled over the radio. "Fire suppression system activated. You have 30 seconds before ignition." The sprinkler system activated with a loud clank, and gasoline began raining down from the ceiling. The smell was overwhelming, and Sarah knew they were all about to die if they could not reach safety. But the creatures were afraid of the gasoline too. As the accelerant soaked their hair, the parasites within began writhing frantically, as if they could sense the approaching destruction. The creatures retreated, giving Sarah and the prisoners a clear path to the stairs. They ran up toward the ground floor, gasoline-soaked and desperate. Behind them, Sarah could hear Agent Tor's counting down over the radio. 10 seconds, 9, 8. They burst through the exit door just as the basement exploded into flames. The fire raced through the sprinkler system, turning the entire lower level into an inferno that could be seen for miles. The heat was so intense that windows on the upper floors began shattering from thermal expansion. Sarah and the rescued prisoners stumbled away from the building, coughing and gasping. Behind them, the abandoned chemical plant burned like a beacon in the night, and from within the flames, they could hear the death screams of creatures that had terrorized humanity for centuries. Agent Torres appeared out of the darkness, her face grim but satisfied. "Emergency services are on the way. We need to get these people medical attention." As sirens wailed in the distance, Sarah looked back at the burning building. "Is it over? Did we get them all?" "The ones here, yes. But Sarah, we both know this facility was just one cell of a larger network. The creatures you described have been operating for hundreds of years. They're not going to be destroyed by burning down a few buildings." Sarah nodded, understanding the implication. Tonight had been a victory, but the war was far from over. Somewhere out there, more of these parasitic creatures were hunting, feeding, and converting human hosts to their cause. But for the first time since escaping Blackwood Manor, Sarah felt something other than fear and desperation. She felt purpose. She had found allies who believed her story and weapons that could actually hurt these things. The creatures had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed that humans were just livestock to be harvested. They had not anticipated that their prey might fight back with intelligence, determination, and the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect others. As the chemical plant burned behind them and the freed prisoners received medical care, Sarah began planning the next phase of the campaign. Because Agent Torres was right about one thing. This was bigger than just one facility or even one group of creatures. This was a war for the future of the human species. And Sarah Williams, a 19-year-old former housemaid from Virginia, was going to make sure humanity won. Screams in the mansion. Only the black maid saw what was hiding in his hair HFY story.